Discipline Priest offers some very steady output and absolutely elite healing when you have an execute target present, allowing you to deal high amounts of damage while still being able to maintain strong healing in both raids and M+. Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, here to bring you my raid and M+ guide for Discipline Priest in Midnight Season 1. First, starting it off with our M+ setup. In a Mythic Plus environment, you had the option between Voidweaver and Oracle, but the nerfs that went out on March 17th really massively hit Voidweaver, more so than they ended up hitting Oracle, so I would not recommend playing Voidweaver in keys. I would just recommend playing Oracle. Disc plays very similarly between raids and M+, and the builds you'll see look very similar as well, with huge emphasis on dot damage in your Shadow Word Pain, taking talents like Pain and Suffering alongside talents like Expiation, where your Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death are consuming Shadow Word Pain and dealing bonus damage. You're also playing very heavily along your Shadow Fiend pet, which is now a passive. This is spawning from utilizing your Shadow Word Death whenever a target is being hit in execute range, sub 20%. And this Shadow Fiend is also going to be doing extra attacks for you in a couple of different ways. Their baseline melee attacks are going to regen mana for you, and when you cast Penance, Mind Blast, or Shadow Word Death, you're also triggering Inescapable Torment, which is a bonus attack that is dealing cleave AoE damage. It's only converting into Atonement healing off of one enemy struck. You also have Death's Torment, which is causing your Shadow Word Death to deal damage additional times at a lower effectiveness, but it's also consuming your Expiation, which can make for some incredibly high damage, especially when you're maintaining your Shadow Word Pain or even potentially spreading it around. So Atonement, your healing that you are placing onto your allies by doing damage, needs to be applied by a few different spells. You have Powered Radiance, which is your main spell to apply Atonement to 5 allies. You have your Power Word Shield, which is offering a shield and putting up this buff onto your allies. Flash Heal will apply Atonement to your target and also to yourself, since we're running with the Binding Heals talent in our class tree. And you have access to Plea. Plea is a single target Atonement applier, which you really only use in raids, and we'll talk about it more in raids, but it's often not really utilized in a Mythic Plus environment. Your big fundamentals playing in Mythic Plus is about maintaining your Shadow Word Pain, especially when you walk into a new pull. You want to make sure you are manually hitting multiple targets with Shadow Word Pain. If you're running the talents for dot spread like Encroaching Shadows, you could also use some penance offensively early on when there's not much damage happening to spread around some additional dots. You want to make sure most of the time you're using your Radiance to apply Atonements to your entire party, and your Apex talent is a Void Shield, which is proccing from utilizing Penance. So anytime that you have access to your Void Shield, you want to take advantage of it before you hit a new Penance. As I mentioned in the build section, your Shadow Word Death is insanely important to utilize, not just in Execute, although it's very powerful there, but using Shadow Word Death even outside of Execute is well worth it because it's proccing lots of Expiation value, which is triggering additional damage. When you need to do healing, you'll be predominantly using your Penance defensively. That means casting it onto a friendly ally, instead of casting it offensively, which is casting it onto an enemy. You can use it for damage, you can cast it onto an enemy when there's not much happening, but the best way to heal is going to be using it defensively, because it's not only going to be healing that target, but every ally that already has Atonement on them is also receiving healing for each Penance bolt that goes into an ally. While your Mind Blast ability doesn't do a lot of damage on its own, it is also triggering your Expiation and your Inescapable Torment, which is the bonus pet attacks. And it also is activating Power of the Dark Side, which is buffing up the damage and healing of your penance. So think about Mind Blast as a way to enable further damage and further healing for other abilities. Discipline also has access to a few different very powerful cooldowns. Your Evangelism is now automatically casting a Power Word Radiance when you utilize it, and so you can think about this as just another way to apply atonements, but also it is spawning a Mindbender that is going to continuously be attacking your enemies for the next 12 seconds and regenerating mana for you. And like we mentioned before, it can also be proccing that Inescapable Torment through Mind Blast, Penance, and Shadow Word Death casts. And so this is a very powerful cooldown you can take advantage of, which regens mana and increases your damage in a substantial way. So if you can find opportunities to be hitting execute targets with your Mindbender already out, that can trigger additional attacks. It can spawn more of your Shadow Fiends to help you attack your enemies and result in some very powerful Atonement healing. You have the option between Ultimate Penitence and Barrier. I would highly recommend that you run with Ultimate Penitence, because even though it's a little weaker than it was in beta with some of the other supporting talents getting nerfed, it's still a massive shield that you can apply to yourself. And you want to make sure you're targeting an enemy whenever you activate Ultimate Penitence, so it's raining down large amounts of penance bolts into enemies. And finally, you have your double charges of pain suppression. When you're running with the talent Protector the Frail, your Power Word Shield uses are also going to give you additional cooldown reduction for your pain sups, and so you also have additional 10% damage reduction with the Oracle talents, which means you have a 50% damage reduction every time you cast pain suppression onto a target. This is not only insanely good for your tanks, but it's also a major life-saving tool you could put onto any of your allies, especially on moments where you know that there's high damage, especially like dots or bleeds. Those are key times if you know somebody does not have a defensive to slam that pain suppression on them and protect them. So let's put it all together in how you want to play Disc. When it comes to rot damage encounters, you have lots of steady damage going out onto your entire party, and so you'll often start by making sure you've maintained your Shadow or Pain onto the enemies. You'll apply your Atonements either through Radiance or maybe even Evangelism, and then you will use your Shadow or Death and continuously be using it on cooldown no matter what. You then follow through with using one of your penances, because you'll be holding 2 charges thanks to the Oracle talents. With this, you can have a chance to proc your Void Shield, and so if it procs and there's good damage to kind of soak up in a ticking damage or rot damage environment, feel free to be utilizing it on cooldown. In between my penance casts, I like to make sure I use my Mind Blast as best I can to proc that Power of the Dark Side and make my follow-up penance more powerful. This is the big area where you're doing most of your healing, is using your Shadow or Death, your penances, and your Mind Blast. Because if you can find a target that also is in execute range with a Shadow or Death, you'll be proccing that Shadow Fiend, and then your Mind Blast, Penance, and more Shadow or Deaths are proccing additional attacks, resulting in some very powerful Atonement healing. The real trick with dealing with rot damage, though, is making sure you're not sending out all your penances constantly when everyone's already full HP. It's about spreading it out a little bit, and that's where utilizing smites to kind of give you additional time to let people kind of rot down and tick down a little bit more before you send another penance and top everybody back off can be absolutely important. If there's any sort of mechanics that are going to be dealing an extra burst of damage, you'll see it in like Seed of the Triumvirate on like Lura, where there's these beams that go out and deal an additional chunk of damage. Making sure you save your penances or maybe even your Shadow or Death just before that moment can make things even more consistent for your allies. Or if you know somebody's going to take massive damage, hitting them with that pain suppression so that they are going to be as stable as possible. Burst damage scenarios can be particularly challenging for Discipline when they're not in execute range. Encounters like Viceroy, Korite Kazareth, even Vordaza in Myzara Caverns could all be really bursty at high levels of damage, and this is where you want to take advantage of either your pain suppressions or your uppies to sort of isolate targets. And what I mean by that is you have a few different abilities like pain suppression or ultimate penitence, which can make one target, well, basically immune. If you know that there's going to be a huge damage on everybody, and you have either your defensive penances or even your Shadow Men, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is buffing your flash heals massively. These can all be different ways to allow you to better heal everybody asymmetrically. And so if you hit an ultimate penitence in a high damage period, you don't really have to worry about yourself, and the atonement healing can be focused into your allies. If you have personal defensives and you can tank one of the big bursts of damage, but your allies can't, tossing a pain suppression onto them, or realizing that you need to be precasting a flash shield that's buffed by Shadow Men can also be an amazing avenue to keep everybody healthy and safe. Your Shadow Men procs are enormously powerful single target healing, but they're just that, they're procs, and so they often cannot be super heavily relied upon. But if you know that you already have stacks going into a pull or a difficult encounter, then you kind of factor those in, especially when you see that one person is taking massive amounts of damage. For some final tips, you can be using your Power Word Shield on cooldown, but keep in mind that it does cost a lot of mana, and shields are not nearly as powerful as they used to be. If your mana feels like it's in a good position, feel free to keep on sending normal Power Word Shields on cooldown. Otherwise, I like to hold it unless I have a Void Shield proc, or I use it in like an emergency situation when I need to have tons of healing or some kind of shield on somebody at this moment right away. When it comes to stats, you're going to be focusing on haste first for Oracle, followed by crit, versatility, and then mastery. Raid is going to be slightly different, where you focus on haste, crit, then mastery, and then versatility. The raid build for Discipline plays very similarly, and you can see that the builds are almost exactly the same with a few key differences. One of which being I often am going to be taking Encroaching Shadows because there's a lot of encounters where you are going to take advantage of that additional dot spread for your Shadow or Pain by hitting Penance onto an enemy. But we'll talk about the situations where you use Penance offensively versus defensively. You can also drop Shadow Mend. I think there's some times where it can be good to utilize for some extra prio healing, but there's also moments where you're focusing on your ramp, your big healing onto the entire raid, and it can be difficult to weave in that additional Shadow Mend healing. While Holy Ray is not a great talent, it's a little bit of extra healing that can help your burst output. And like we mentioned in the Mythic Plus environment, dots are a massive part of your overall healing as well as your executes. You'll see the same talents in Expiation, Death's Torment, Inescapable Torment, and Shadow Fiend, all taken for a raid environment, just like they're taken for a Mythic Plus environment. The big difference that when it comes down to your raid output is that you are building up massive amounts of atonement onto the entire party, and then utilizing your penances defensively to heal everybody for sustained burst output. You're not as spiky as you were in previous expansions, but you are still sustaining long periods of consistent healing. So how do you ramp? Well, first you start by maintaining and refreshing your Shadow Word Pain. It should have at least 20 seconds onto its duration. Then you cast a defensive penance, which could proc a Void Shield, but if it doesn't, you could just cast a Power Word Shield as well. Follow it up with a Plea cast, then cast Flash Shield, which applies atonement to your target and to yourself, and this creates 5 atonements. Now, if you have a Void Shield, then you don't need to cast that Plea in between the shield and the Flash Shield, but if you didn't, then you should get 5 atonements right here. Then when you cast your Evangelism, that's also going to cast a Power Word Radiance and cause your next 2 Radiance casts to be instant. Then you want to make sure you're applying a Radiance, usually to a melee party, and then another Radiance to a range party to put out 20 atonements onto the entire raid. You'll immediately want to use your Shadow Word Death afterwards, followed up by a defensive penance onto an ally, then with a Mind Blast, then another defensive penance, and if you have procced a Void Shield at either of these points, feel free to just send it when you get it. Then you want to make sure you're following up with hitting Smite as much as you possibly can until either your penance or your Shadow Word Death comes off cooldown, and you want to continuously be utilizing those abilities. But there's a little bit more to this equation, and that is taking advantage of additional execute sniping. I would highly recommend, and I'll put it in the description down below as well, having a Mouseover Macro for Shadow Word Death, because there's so many ads in this raid environment that if you can snipe some extra executes, you can proc those pets. They'll also help you regen mana, and they can also trigger a bunch of additional damage. Let's say you're going into your full ramp sequence and you know that there's going to be a couple targets that you could snipe for an execute. If you know you can time them correctly, you can delay your Shadow Word Death. If the option is between hitting a non-execute target versus waiting another second or two and hitting an execute target, that's well worth doing. And a lot of Disc's output can be extremely swingy if you have that execute value. So expect on a lot of boss fights, the people who are able to snipe those executes and find those extra execute targets to spawn additional ads to get a sizable advantage over those who cannot. I also mentioned earlier in our talent section about spreading around your dot damage. Usually what I've seen from a lot of logs is something around 70 or 80% of your penance cast be used defensively. It's very good when you're building up your atonements for your ramp. It's very good when you have all your atonements out. And you'll often have some downtime in between your ramps where you can be using your penance offensively to help spread around a little bit of additional dot damage, particularly on some fights like the Paladins, where you're fighting 3 enemies at once, and having that dot spread can be very, very powerful, especially when it comes into a mini ramp. And these are some of your ramps where you're applying atonements to maybe close to 20 players and not having your evangelism available. You will have access to about 4 radiance casts in between each evangelism cooldown that you can take advantage of. And so you're looking for the next round of damage where you can be applying individual atonements with void shields, defensive penance, flash shield, or plea, then utilizing your double radiances together, and then following it up with that same damage sequence of Shadow or Death, defensive penance, mind blast, and more defensive penance. Some of the biggest constraints for Discipline can be about how much mana that you have access to apply additional atonements for those mini ramps. Utilizing Power Word Shield on cooldown is a really good way to yourself and not have the mana to spend on pleas or shields when you're trying to mini ramp. So only be using your Power Word Shield when you have a Void Shield proc, or if you know you have Source Magic or Innervates or something like that that can give you the additional resources to be very aggressive with those applications. The best way to really be consistently spending your mana is to be spending it during your ramp sequence when you know damage is going to be happening, and then utilizing Smite, the offensive penance, and spending time refreshing or spreading around your dots during downtime in between your ramp sequences. But how do you know when damage is going to be happening? Well, you can take advantage of websites like lorgs.io, where you can look at logs and you can look at an accumulated timeline for when damage events are going to be happening. Then there is a little area where the names are hidden, and you can actually mouse over the names, click on the little paper bar, which is allowing you to copy some of the setup and some of the timings. And these are very good for encounters like Voracious, for example, that are incredibly scripted and the same mechanics are happening at the exact same times. And it makes it a lot easier to know exactly when you want to set up for your healing and when you want to utilize your cooldowns. You can copy these notes on the website, and then you can actually paste them into your Northern Sky or your Mythic Raid tools in those reminders tabs. And then you can have a nice little pop-up that shows, hey, you want to use your evangelism or your uppies 20 seconds from now, so start getting ready. It's a really excellent tool, and I also have some videos in our new player playlist that allows you to look at how you can utilize these websites and utilize these tools to set up for your healing. So that's our guide for Disc for Raid and M+ for Midnight Season 1. If you're looking for trinkets, consumables, any other updates, be sure to check out our written guides on Wowhead in the description down below as well. Thanks so much for watching. Big love to our patrons for making all this content possible. If you'd like to join them and get access to some extra benefits, be sure to check it out in the description down below as well. Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll catch you all next time.